morning, everybody. May we request you to take your seats. We have Secretary John Kerry with us, and we would like to start. First of all, Mr. Secretary, may I extend a very, very warm welcome to you back to India. You are a person who's well recognized, a critical architect of so many different aspects of the India-US relationship. How does it feel to be back?
It's great to be back. In fact, first of all, Ambassador, thank you, and thanks for your distinguished career. And I just say to everybody that I think some of my earliest trips as a young senator, I came here in the 1990s, early 90s, and I brought the first business delegation as then Finance Minister Singh was putting forward all the reforms. And so for a long time, I've been involved in trying to strengthen the relationship and work to help the nuclear agreement and so forth. But let me just say to everybody, 100 years old celebration. And I was sitting there thinking to myself for the first time in my life, I've been around for 80 of those 100 years. and so that scared the hell out of me earlier today. And I'm very busy trying to convince my staff that 80 is the new 60. There we go, 2 octogenarians here. But I want you all to know, I'm also trying to convince them that I can do all the things I used to do when I was 55. I just don't remember what they are. It's a difficult transition, I want you to know. Anyway, glad to be with you.
Well, wonderful. And we're going to take advantage of you being here by going through a set of issues, if you permit. You already saw our foreign minister in the previous interaction here talk a lot about President Trump. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of interest in the US elections, in the suspense that has now resulted in Donald Trump regaining the White House for the second time. Would you like to tell us what you anticipate will be his immediate priorities, perhaps the difference between campaign and actual governance, and what will he give up and what will he push?
Well, first of all, I think everybody in the world has learned that it's very hard to predict anything about President Trump. There's no way to know with certainty exactly what will happen. And that unpredictability is something that he actually cultivates and appreciates in himself. I think it's clear he's going to try to shake some things up. You will see a series of executive orders issued on day one. I hope one of those orders will not include pulling out of the Paris Agreement, but it probably will. And there's really no good reason to be doing that. As the chairman of ExxonMobil said from Baku the other day, he didn't advise it because he thinks it would be counterproductive and against the interests of the United States. But he will do something on day one. He will have other executive orders that probably deal with his deportation promises and that deal with the question of immigration. But he'll take some flagship issues and just try to put them out there right away. You can count on that. The Congress will work carefully on these appointees because there are troubling aspects to a number of them. But I think that, I also think on the positive side, let me say to everybody, I think that President Trump, because of circumstances, you know from diplomacy requires a ripeness to be able to solve a problem. I worked very hard for the 4 years I was Secretary of State to see if we could advance the process in the Middle East. And in the end, the 2 leaders were both of them, President Abbas, Prime Minister Netanyahu, just not ready to do it. They weren't willing to take the political capital, expend it, do whatever. So it wasn't ripe. And there are plenty of places where things are not ripe. But I think Ukraine is a place where things are ripe. And possibly, depending on the theory of the case, you could have a rapprochement that could take place in the Middle East where you have an agreement with Saudi Arabia and Israel, which is accompanied by some kind of an agreement on ceasefire and you know, how you're going to approach the reconstruction of Gaza, which is very complicated because nobody wants to give money to go do something again. And this is part of the calculation, I think.
Right.
So I think, you know, I think that Ukraine, President Zelensky has made it clear what his vision is, but I think that the pressure is growing among many European countries, in the United States and elsewhere, to find a way to not have this inflammatory situation just perpetuated. And I can see several different ways where you could have an agreement on land, you could have an agreement on defense, mutual defense that doesn't include joining NATO. You could have an agreement on the economics. You could have agreement on the new border or demilitarized zone or any number of different things you could call it. I think both leaders and both countries are going to look for a way to be able to say they satisfied something of what they needed to do. So Putin can claim a victory and say, look, I got people to recognize that we have a right to some of this land. And on the other hand, I think Zelensky and the people of Ukraine can hold their heads as high as you can hold heads because they've done an absolutely extraordinary job of preventing the takeover of Ukraine and preventing the invasion of Kiev. So you can find something there, hopefully, and hopefully the leaders will leave the political space for that to happen, because if they use the wrong rhetoric or they get involved in the wrong kinds of claims up front, you may make it harder for people to go forward. So it's a good time for some quiet, really effective diplomacy.
But that's wonderful to hear you say that, because the broad sense on Ukraine has been that he's going to abandon it. President-elect Trump is going to abandon Ukraine. The Europeans are extremely nervous. But if you say that he could actually, you know, he calls himself the great deal maker, and whether he can actually make this deal and whether this would be acceptable to Europeans, to Zelensky, as well as to Putin, that would be amazing.
Well, let me say ahead of time, I don't believe this is an issue that requires exceptional negotiating skills. This is a pretty straightforward challenge where the parameters are pretty clear to everybody. And the question is more, will people be willing to overcome ambition and revenge and other ingredients of personal human behavior in order to be able to find the practical way forward? If President Trump were just to pull out, I think he'd have some major challenges within his own party. And I think that globally, the repercussions of that would be just as damaging as anything you could ever imagine, because for Moldova or for Georgia or for you know, Finland or Lithuania, the Baltics, they live with a very real sense of fear of possible mischief from Russia. And Russia plays that on a daily basis. So I think that wisdom will predicate that they really do try to find a way that does not send a signal that you can win everything you want by invading another country. And that's critical for India, vis-a-vis China or someone else. It's critical for all of us, I think. There must be principles that come out of here hardened in any resolution that takes place. And that'll be the big question mark in any kind of negotiation.
Right. And Mr. Secretary, you referred briefly to the other crisis that's in the Middle East. And things look less possible within the scope of negotiations there at the moment. My guess would be Mr. Trump would want to go back to the Abraham Accords, but the things have changed dramatically. Where do you see the path there?
Will you forgive me if I sort of come back to something you first asked about Trump and the election?
Please.
And I was listening to Foreign Minister Jaishankar, who I have great respect for and who's a very smart man. But I wanted to refine a little bit what happened in this election. President Trump, very cleverly in his campaign, writ broadly, did what challenger to the Biden administration succession always do, which is scare the hell out of people and play to the lowest common denominator of politics, fear. And disinformation defined a lot of what people were perceiving. A lot of disinformation, some of it from other countries, some of it on the internet internally in the United States. In the end, the two biggest driving issues were immigration and inflation. Despite inflation coming down, despite significant, strength in the American economy. I mean, I think we're the strongest economy on the planet today. And despite that, and getting better, people didn't feel it. And I had a professor at university who said to me, all politics is a consequence of felt needs. And the felt needs of people in the United States were, we're not getting our fair share. There's an anger, which is a tide over from earlier years, not just during this administration. Globalization, which the foreign minister mentioned, has had a negative impact in many places, even as it's had a very positive impact. But when you see the wealth disparity in our country, if you have any sense of conscience or rectitude, it's disgusting. It's horrendous. And people have a right to be angry about their inability to share on the upsides of a lot of things that are happening. So in addition to those two things, my party, the Democratic Party, I regret to say, was somewhat tone deaf to some of the cultural issues that were out there floating. And there were people who did see it and there were people who didn't.
Yes.
But there was not sensitivity to the deep felt feel among many people in America, everywhere, that their America somehow is being diluted and changed. And I think there were plenty of ways to address that, but it wasn't addressed. And so I think that's why the loss took place. Now, the loss, if you look at it, folks, it's not a huge, yes, no battleground state was won by Kamala Harris, but on the other hand, everything was within a point and a half.
Yes.
Really close. So the things I just mentioned could have tipped it either way if it had been responded to.
Yes.
So I think every politician in America needs to take note of the dynamics of this last year. Now, coming back to your question about
the Middle East.
The Middle East. Yes, the Abraham Accords will be quickly resumed. And the corollary to the Abraham Accords was the notion that Saudi Arabia could make peace with Israel, and that would lay the groundwork for, sort of moving before it. I spent 4 years as Secretary of State trying to advance the process in Israel. And as I said, the two leaders didn't want to do it. Now I think things have changed a little bit in certain ways, and some for the good and some for the bad. The events of October 7th, honestly, were as egregious, as horrendous, as disgusting, as craven, as bestial, as anything I've seen in a big, broad way in a long, long time. And I fought in a war, I fought in Vietnam, I've been to war, I know what things are like. But this was uglier. There was a misogynistic, racist, deep-rooted rage that was expressed on that day. And it had a profound impact on the body politic of Israel. And Israelis, even those who were pushing for two-state solution, and who believe in the fairness of that division, they're chastened today. They feel that there's going to have to be a new definition of security for them to really be able to buy into another state. And so that doesn't mean you can't do it. I think you can do it, but it's going to take longer. It's going to take building capacity among the Palestinians. It's going to take a process of building trust, of gaining confidence. And here's the danger, folks. The government of the right that is currently there, not one single member publicly supports, or even privately, a Palestinian state. And so when the Oslo Accords were signed, there were 110,000 settlers in the West Bank. Today, there are about 600,000. And even 2 weeks into the war, Israel announced 13,000 new units of building in the West Bank. Now, you know full well, diplomatically and so forth, the Oslo Accords promised transition to give land back starting in 1993 and moving forward. It's not happened. And you now openly, last week, saw one minister anyway, maybe a couple, talking about annexation of the West Bank.
That's right.
Now, if you had annexation of the West Bank, folks, everything that has preceded us is difficult to see how it works. I got a set of principles agreed to before I left as secretary. And among those principles, the Arab world accepted the idea that Israel would be a Jewish state. But there are 1.6 million Arabs in Israel, Israeli Arabs. And what is the status of a Jewish state where, will they be allowed to vote? Will those other people, it won't in fact be if they could elect a prime minister who wasn't Jewish, and that's not going to happen, obviously. So then what kind of state do you have? So this is a monumental challenge still, and it's going to take a lot of work to try to pull people together, and frankly, it's going to take a while. Now, I think Trump, again, is the beneficiary of the agony of these last months, which people will want to get behind them somehow. And I think there will be some momentum to be able to find a way to give people more hope and to begin to build a future. But believe me, there's nothing much left of Gaza. And those people do not want to be driven out. And I think the advocates of a two-state solution are going to continue to press for them to be treated more fairly and effectively.
And thereby hangs the tail, because even the Saudi Arabian ruler, Prince MBS, has said just a couple of days ago that he can't really normalize unless there is movement towards a Palestinian state. So you're absolutely right to lay out that very, very complicated situation. Just moving a little bit away from the Middle East, but not fully away, you were one of the architects of the nuclear agreement with Iran, the JCPOA, and President Trump pulled out of that agreement, pulled the US out of that agreement. Is that a door which is completely shut now, or is that a door which is completely shut, or can we go back on that?
Well, I don't think the door is completely shut, but it depends on whether or not the Trump administration wants to find a way to walk through the door. And I am convinced that Iran sent some signals in the last weeks indicating they'd like to find a better path. The tragedy of what President Trump did in just pulling out of that agreement, folks, for which there was no rational reason to pull out. I mean, I'm just being direct and honest about it. If you didn't like the agreement, you at least had 15 years before anything changed in it. And during those 15 years, you could have worked with Iran to establish greater trust in the Non-Proliferation Treaty Agreement and other things. But just pulling out did the very thing that Ayatollah Khamenei feared the most and said publicly to his negotiators, don't negotiate with the great Satan because they will not be trusted. And when Donald Trump pulled out, he fed that to them. And the result was that the IRGC, the Republican Guard, were elected, and the hardliners came in. Now there's a new group there after the president was killed in the helicopter crash, and it appears that maybe there's a little breath of capacity here to be able to work differently. But look, in that agreement that we came to on Iran, we took a nuclear weapon off the table. We put it away. We made it clear that you could not break out and create a weapon in Iran in the period of about a year and 2 to 3 months. That's how long breakout would take. Today, because of pulling out, breakout is about a week from now, a week from whenever it would occur. And in the agreement we did with Iran, Iran had to destroy 13,000 centrifuges, which they used to create uranium enriched in order to have a bomb. You have to destroy them. They have to destroy their plutonium reactor with cement put into the core of the reactor, could never be used again. They had to open up television in all of their production facilities. We put 130 people on the ground in Tehran every day, checking everything. We had, we had limits on we had tracking on their mining of uranium, all the way from the mine through to the post-use of the centrifuges. So they were really in a box.
And Israel was still not happy with it.
No, but the security establishment of Israel all agreed this made Israel safer. And Israel is less safe today, the region is less safe today, because Iran could decide to break out. Now, I don't think they will break out. I think in the end, they're going to decide that is not in their interest. And they'll use the bargaining, hopefully, to figure out how the pathway is going to be laid for having a more normal relationship with the world. But that's going to have to require giving up their bellicosity and threats to Israel and their support for Hezbollah and Houthi and Hamas. So big decisions are going to have to be made, but I think there will be a lot of effort to try to push that process forward, and I'm encouraged by that. It is good that there will be effort to try to find a way forward, and I think they will try to.
Of course, Mr. Secretary, another thing which you've invested years on, and you've been flying relentlessly around the world, is to push climate change as the president's special envoy. And we have the COP29 going on in Baku, and we have, in the hottest year recorded in history, we have the prospect of President Trump pulling out of Paris again. Yeah. Can we still carry on the fight for 1.5 degrees?
No, we are blowing past 1.5 degrees right now as we sit here. I want to appeal to all of you. India is a country that has managed very complex challenges, Pakistan, Kashmir, China, borders, so forth, for a long, long time. And one of the things that I appreciate so enormously in India is the consciousness that is brought to public life and to issues. And the very legitimate effort to behave honorably and make things happen that make things good for other people. And you are managing 1.4 billion people in an extraordinarily difficult situation. But I will tell you, we need India, and we need China, and we need Russia, and the United States, and Europe, and some other key countries must come together to deal with this issue, which is existential. And nothing that President Biden tried to do or I tried to do in these last 4 years came from anything political. No ideology, no politics, no liberal, conservative, one party, BCP, whatever. No, it was driven by mathematics and physics and some biology and chemistry. And it doesn't lie. And we are now living globally with the consequences. Just last week, there was a major report that came out from scientists pointing out that forests and land and ocean that are called sinks, it's where the CO2 gets consumed and stored, taken away from doing damage. that they have noticed a significant drop in the ability of those forests to be able to contain CO2. We're seeing an increased rate of melting of the great ice sheets of the Arctic and the Antarctic. Sea level rise higher, storms more intense than ever. Why are the storms more intense? Science will tell you. Because as the ocean warms and 90% of the heating of the planet goes into the ocean, moisture goes up out of the ocean, travels around the planet with the prevailing winds and drops in rainfall, and you have higher acidity that changes the chemistry of the ocean, and it is changing it all around the world. And you also have torrential rainfall because you have this moisture rising into the air and traveling around the planet. There are a whole bunch of other things scientifically connected. I don't even have time to go through them all. But every year is the next year that's hotter than the year before. I was in the Senate in 1988 when Jim Hansen told us it's happening. Climate change is here. And we went to Rio in 1992 and we worked to try to change things, but it was a voluntary system. So nobody wanted to be the first to be really big volunteer and reduce in big amounts. So we didn't. So then we got to Paris. We did the Paris Agreement, which Donald Trump wants to pull out of. In the Paris Agreement, folks, it's a monument to common but differentiated responsibility. Every country only does what they think they can do in the Paris Agreement. And it wasn't until we got to Dubai last year where the UAE consensus produced 200 nations saying, we must transition away from fossil fuel. And we must accelerate in this decade. We must do it in a fair, equitable, and orderly way so as to achieve net zero by 2050. Well, guess what, folks? Emissions go up last year, 1% all around the world. It's going up. And we have gas and oil that's going to go to record levels, and coal, record levels of burning. And you look at the air quality that we see here right now in Delhi. And it's around the world. 7 million people a year are now dying as a consequence of bad air quality on an annual basis. And that is going to grow. So look, I'm not here to just blast people or whatever, but I do ask the question is, what is it about humanity that when we know we're facing something existential, we cannot do the things we know we ought to do? And by the way, those things are not frightening to the economy. I just joined up with a group. We're an investing group. We're going to invest. We're putting out new technologies that can deal with this faster. Solar is now so much cheaper than fossil fuel. Wind, cheaper than fossil fuel. Geothermal will be cheaper than fossil fuel. Hydro, we have the ability today to meet the goals we set for 2030. But we're not on track to meet them because business as usual, greed, whatever, is keeping people from doing what we need to do. I'm telling you, absolutely, every study shows it is cheaper to do what we need to do to transition now rather than wait. And there'll be far more damage as we wait. And you already see every country where we have to do adaptation. We've got to spend money to adapt now to the situation. Yes, we do. But think of what's happening down the road. When I started this in 2020 as a formal position for President Biden, we were heading to 4 degrees, 3.7 degrees of warming on the planet. Because of what we got out of Glasgow, Sharm el-Sheikh, and then Dubai, if we did everything we promised to do, we could actually hold the Earth's temperature increase to about 1.7 degrees. But we're not doing what we know we should do and we know how to do. The economy on the other side of this transition, folks, is bigger, better, more, you will make more money. The new technologies with new transmission lines that can take 5 times the power that we had before. So we have an ability to get power, empower people who haven't been empowered. We have hydrogen is really coming down in price. There are great gains in that. We have batteries now. Germany is at 50% renewable for a very industrialized country. And they're going up to 80% renewable. Why aren't the rest of it? All around the world, my country too. We need to be doing things that will accelerate this process. And I'll put this on the table. We're not going to win this unless, 48 sub-Saharan African states equal 0.55% of all the emissions. They're not the problem. The problem are about 23 countries, the developed and near developed countries. China's number one emitter, 30% of all the emissions on the planet. United States is number 2. India is number 3. Europe and Russia sort of flow behind. Brazil, Indonesia, we know where they are. We have to work together to help each other to be able to find a way forward. We need to put more money on the table for development. We need to be able to deploy those technologies, and we need to make the world a fairer place for everybody who's alive today, but also for the next generation and for our kids and grandkids. And that's really what's on the line, folks. We've got to get those 23, 25 countries in a room and figure out how we are going to do what we know how to do.
And we're going to need your energy, Mr. Secretary, to continue this in or out of office. And I do sense a note of optimism in despite everything you say, because you are an
I know
optimist.
time is up, but can I say to everybody, I genuinely am optimistic. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing. President Kennedy said that the problems of the world are mostly caused by human choices, and therefore they can be solved. I believe in that. I believe we have solutions. We've got to, kick ourselves in the rear end and go out and put these things together. But I'm optimistic because actually life is better today for many people, most people in the world. Far, far fewer people are being killed violently than were in the last century. We've cured diseases we never thought we'd cure. We have longer longevity for life. We have extraordinary opportunities in many parts of the world. We're still not, it's not even, needs to get better. But we have a vision that we can build off of from what we have already accomplished. From post-World War II through the next 30, 40 years, a lot of places have grown in their ability to have a decent life day to day. My hope is that we'll recognize that, and it should reinforce that we can do this, but we have to be more determined about making it fair and orderly and equitable as we go about that. And women, particularly around the world, women today, it's not where it ought to be. There's still a glass ceiling, but there is far more CEOs of companies, women in the military sharing responsibilities. There are women in high chief executive offices all around the world. And there's been a real, if you're a woman pregnant, you give birth to a child, that child is 50% more likely to be fed and go to school than they were in the last century. So there are reasons to be really optimistic. And it's just a question of doing what we know we ought to do with the things that we already have available to do it with. Do that, we get it done.
Thank you so much. We know you have a 19-hour flight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Kerry.